Michael. Just want to say thank you to Michael and also the entire Spiritus Christi community. My beloved wife, Kara, and I have really been delighted to participate in Spiritus Christi remotely since February last year. So I'm really delighted to be with you and to share this evening as we journey into Lent. I want to start just by telling a story about my dad's parents, so my paternal grandparents. My last name is a Russian name. Mikulich is the Russian. And my grandparents escaped serfdom in Belarus about 120 years ago. And as I was growing up and visiting, whenever we would visit my grandparents, they would tell their stories of how they grew up in Belarus and why they escaped serfdom to try to find freedom here in the United States. And particularly, I just want to share one little story from my grandmother. You know, my grandparents had walked across the Polish frontier for several hundred miles to try to get to a bottom of a boat to make it to the United States. When my grandmother got to a dock in Poland, it was a dark night. There was no moon. She literally could not see. She didn't know where she was. And she was afraid that she was going to fall into the sea. And in the very moment of that darkness, a hand grabbed her and helped to pull her into the boat. And for my grandmother, that hand is the hand of God. And with my memory of my grandmother experiencing the hand of God and in the hand of that person who brought her onto that boat, I want to call to mind refugees from Ukraine, refugees and migrants from all over the Americas and throughout the world who need God's hand through our hands. And I'm also thinking of people in our own land who are being evicted, people who have become homeless, people who cannot afford gas and oil, among other afflictions. So it's with just that little story that I want to enter into a conversation about the work of Sister Constance FitzGerald and St. John of the Cross on societal dark night. But before I get into that, a disclaimer. I'm not a Carmelite, so I'm still a student of Constance FitzGerald, and I'm still a student of St. John of the Cross.
Nobody else.
I welcome insights from others when we have time for conversation tonight. So the way I'm proceeding, just to let you know, for the first part of my presentation, I'm going to introduce the work of Sister Constance FitzGerald and St. John of the Cross on what's called the dark night of the soul. And then the second half of my presentation, I'm going to dig into societal dark night, which is and I'll refer to Sister Connie. Sister Connie has reinterpreted John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila for our time in terms of societal dark night.
And Alex, if it's okay, if people have questions along the way, if you just either put your question in the chat or take yourself off of mute, would that be all right? Or do you want people to save questions till the end?
Yeah, if you have a question, go ahead, just unmute yourself. Say, Alex, I have a question or comment. That's fine. That's fine.
Okay, or if you put it in the chat, I'll keep an eye on the chat. And
yeah, if you could keep an eye on the chat, because that'll distract me.
Okay, and is there a way to, we are able to see both your current slide and the next slide and notes? Is there a way to just bring up, just in case people may not be able to read the text on the slide?
Okay.
If you, it looks like in the upper left corner, if there's something that says use slideshow. Awesome. Thank you. Hopefully that works at your end.
So the first off, I just want to take a moment to gather ourselves, to bring ourselves here, and begin with just breathing and centering and silence. And just notice your breathing. You can start to pay attention to your breathing and or to your heartbeat. And just become aware of where you're sitting, where you're at. Find a comfortable position. And, if you're distracted by concerns of the day that you have, whatever that may be, as things come to mind and heart, we can just peacefully acknowledge that and come back to our work together this evening. So, and I want to just start with a moment of silence, just because this is really critical for the Carmelite tradition, and really the whole tradition of Christianity. So by way of introduction, I just want to talk a little bit about the Carmelite tradition. What is it about? Where does it come from? Carmelites, their major symbol is Mount Carmel, which is a mountain it's in northern Israel and Palestine. It's been a sacred place in many traditions. It's sacred in Egyptian history since 16 centuries before Jesus walked on the earth, or what we call BCE, before the Christian era. And then in early Christianity, monks and hermits would go to Mount Carmel for a place of silence and solitude, and to really nurture contemplation in God's love. And so it's with that background that the first Carmelites became formalized in the Catholic Church in the 12th century. So the original order of Carmelites is now like over 800 years old. And then just a little bit about, I'll refer to her as Sister Connie. Sister Connie is a Carmelite with the Baltimore Carmel. She entered the Baltimore Carmel in 1951. And she's really, her whole life witness, she has been instrumental in really taking up the renewal of Vatican II. In particular, her work has been focused on education for contemplative transformation, particularly drawing upon the works of St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa of Avila. And in particular, what we're focusing on tonight in terms of societal dark night, that's been her entire life work. And so she's really imparted quite amazing, very deep gifts to the church. And then just a word about my own encounter with the theology and spirituality of Sister Connie. When my colleagues, I'm a Catholic social ethicist and theologian. My colleagues, Lori Cassidy, Margie File, and I, we published a book in 2007 entitled Interrupting White Privilege, Catholic Theologians Break the Silence. And as soon as we had finished that work, we realized that we really needed to take up the problem of over-incarceration of Black and Brown people in the United States. And if we were going to contend with the enormity of the punitive system of incarceration that we have here in the United States, we would really need a spirituality and a transformation of consciousness that would have the capacity to move people to be transformed, to end this really cruel system in our country. And so our book, The Scandal of White Complicity in US Hyper-Incarceration, A Nonviolent Spirituality of White Resistance. Okay, that work is grounded in the work of Sister Constance FitzGerald, in addition to the sociological and historical work that we do in that particular book. And then I have a picture of, this is another book that I contributed to this in this past year. And for those of you who might be interested in going more deeply into Sister Connie's work, this book, Desire, Darkness, and Hope, Theology in a Time of Impasse, is a collection of 11 essays by theologians reflecting on her work. And it's also includes all of her major essays, including essays on Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross. So that's really a gem. And I just want to share that with you for folks who might be interested in delving deeper. And then through the evening, I just, I want to share a little bit of John of the Cross's own words. And so here, I want to begin and end with a word of hope. In his poem, The Spiritual Canticle, he begins, this is the very first line of his poem. Where have you hidden, beloved, and left me moaning? Where have you hidden, beloved, and left me moaning? What does he mean here? In his prologue, he explains, and I quote from John of the Cross, the Spirit of the Lord who abides in us and aids our weakness, as St. Paul says in Romans, pleads for us with unspeakable groanings in order to manifest what we can neither fully understand nor comprehend. And so in that line, he's referring to Paul's letter to the Romans, and I quote, "The Spirit too comes to the aid of our weakness, for we do not know how to pray as we ought, but the Spirit intercedes with inexpressible groanings." And so these particular words, "Where have you hidden, beloved, and left me moaning?" St. John of the Cross, as I'll get into this more a little later, he wrote these words while he was imprisoned and at the point of death. But before we dig a little deeper into John of the Cross, a little background about the history of Christian spirituality. Going back to early Christianity, the Christian tradition has described the spiritual life as a journey that corresponds to 3 progressive stages. Okay, and the first one is called purification, or it's also called the purgative way. Okay, and that's much of that is work that we try to do during Lent to eradicate bad habits. And it's also more importantly about cultivating faith, hope, and love, and practicing mercy. You know, feeding the hungry, visiting the imprisoned, tending for, caring for, healing the sick, and so forth. The second way is the illuminative way, which is growth in meditation and contemplative love. And so much of what we're getting into tonight is about all 3 of these: purification, as well as contemplative love, and ultimately our goal is union with the divine. Also, just a little bit, just to provide some context for understanding Sister Connie and John of the Cross. We speak of the cataphaltic life or positive theology. So whenever we're praying with icons, or like today, I was enjoying the beauty of the snowfall here in the land of the Mohican, also known as the Berkshires of Massachusetts. You know, so I was enjoying the snow, and that is part of the cataphaltic life. So it's about being in the creative activity of God in the world. And there are many traditions that are steeped in this way. For example, if you're familiar with Ignatius of Loyola, he invites us to find God in all things. Or with St. Francis, as Pope Francis celebrates in his pastoral letter on ecology, he digs very deeply into St. Francis's love of nature and finding God in nature. So in contrast, what we're talking about tonight is the apophactic life, or what's in theology, we call it negative theology. And all that means is that it's devoid of images, it's symbolic darkness, and we'll talk about that. It emphasizes God's unknowability. But ultimately, both of these approaches will probably experience both of these at some point or different points in our lives. And ultimately, both of these are about union with God and in love with all others in the whole of God's creation. So I want to take a moment to just be with John of the Cross's own words in how he describes the human being. And this is, in my field, this is what we call theological anthropology. Big words. What it's all about is understanding the human person in light of understanding God, in relationship to God and the whole of creation. So John, his words here, I just find really, really hopeful. We might also find them scary, but they're really hopeful because we do have, according to John, he perceives an infinite capacity for God. And so he talks about caverns, and the caverns that he's talking about the intellect and the will and memory. So let's just absorb these words. The capacity of these caverns is deep because the object of this capacity, namely God, is profound and infinite. Thus, in a certain fashion, their capacity is infinite. Their thirst is infinite. Their hunger is also deep and infinite. And their languishing and suffering are infinite death. Although the suffering is not as intense as suffering in the next life, yet the soul is a living image of that infinite privation. This suffering, however, is of another quality because it lies within the recesses of the will's love. And love is not what alleviates the pain, since the greater the love, so much more impatient are such persons for the possession of God, for whom they hope at times with intense longing. So this is very much, he's very focused on desire and God transforming our desire through love. So in light of that, dark night is indivisible from faith, hope, and love. Okay, so in our tradition, faith corresponds to intellect, and faith is darkness to the intellect for John. Progressive nearness to the light of God blinds, disallowing our images and presuppositions about God. Faith is a functional darkness that gives true perspective. For the soul, the excessive light of faith is darkness. Okay, St. John of the Cross, who was called the one of the theologians of a doctor of the church. He's called the Doctor of Hope in 1927. Hope purifies memory and becomes our dwelling place for the desire for the divine. What provided joy and security in the past now leaves us with a sense of emptiness and longing for something that's beyond our grasp. And then just a word about John of the Cross was a very gentle man. He was known as a very gentle and compassionate spiritual director. And he wrote that a good spiritual director will always encourage the person seeking direction. So I'm saying that's important because the dark night, it's not any kind of masochism, nor is it in terms of our own culture. It's not about orientation to success or even wellness. Rather, it's an orientation to God's presence within us, in others, and the whole of creation. So there's a long tradition of dark night that John of the Cross draws upon that we don't have time to dig into. But he was theologically educated, and he drew extensively upon St. Thomas Aquinas to ground what he was saying theologically. It's important to understand that for John, dark night is not something, nor is it an experience. Rather, dark night is someone, namely, it's Jesus Christ. Or I also use the word Sophia, wisdom, which is Sister Connie's interpretation of John's engagement with the wisdom tradition of Scripture. So it's Jesus Christ inside each of us. And Jesus is with us all the time. So dark night is not only purgative, but it's also happens throughout illumination and union. For John of the Cross, the divine is always present, drawing us forward according to the capacities of each person.
Alex, could we pause just for a moment to see if there are any if there's any questions or reflections, because my sense is a lot of this is cumulative, and if we've missed or don't understand something from one of the prior slides, it would be good just to, if there's anything that people want to ask or say, otherwise we'll just kind of keep going. Juliet asks, what is contemplative love?
Okay, great question. Okay, contemplative has different meanings in different traditions. Okay, so I'll just give two different traditions of contemplation. I earlier referred to St. Ignatius of Loyola, and in the spiritual exercises of Loyola, of St. Ignatius of Loyola, contemplation is, it's been described as a loving look at the real. It's very much about that positive theology and engagement with presence to God's presence in the whole of creation. Contemplation, contemplative love for John of the Cross and for the Carmelites, John of the Cross literally describes this contemplation as inflow, as inside of us, God is flowing, working inside of us to transform us into love, even when we may not be aware of it. Does that help?
Yes, Juliet said. Thank you.
Okay, so just moving ahead a little bit. So, we could, obviously we could do a whole course on this, but just briefly, I think it's important to understand the difference between active and passive nights. Okay, so both have to do with God's grace. Both have to do with God's presence in our lives. The active night is decisions and actions that we initiate to purify ourselves. So, for example, this might be in Lenten practices of fasting, prayer, contemplation, and also alms giving. When my son was about 8 or 9, he thought that our pastor said alms giving. And actually, as I was saying at the beginning, if we could extend our arms with welcome arms to people of Ukraine and other peoples around the world, that would be a part of practicing mercy and almsgiving. So that's the active night. The passive night, this is God's action within us that we are not able to sense on our own through our own human finitude. Okay, so if we could really get into depth into the writings of John the Cross, we would be dealing with both with active and passive nights of the senses and then the spirit. So these nights are God transforming all of our senses and transforming our entire being. So there is actually a poem, The Dark Night, that John wrote. And in the poem, the night is both witness and protagonist. The night is our guide and our safety. And the night makes possible our transformation in love with God. And ultimately, when he ends the poem, and I hope that we have time just to read The Dark Night a little later, the end of his poem, The Dark Night, celebrates the delight of union. And when he gets to that point, touch and hearing are activated again, and he can literally smell the beauty of lilies. So John wrote, I quoted from the Spiritual Canticle, and then also we'll work a little bit with his poem, The Dark Night. These come out of his experience of being imprisoned. He was imprisoned in Toledo for his part in Teresa of Avila's reform of the Carmelites. So just for a little bit of context, this is happening at the time of the Counter-Reformation, which the Counter-Reformation is when the Vatican, the Catholic Church, is responding to Luther's reform, at the beginning of the 1500s. So John is imprisoned. He's put into prison, I believe it's December of 1571. He's in prison for 9 months. He's put into a dark, dank, and he describes it as when he first walked in, this cell just, it stunk terribly. It was, he almost vomited upon first walking in to this cell. He had no change of clothing, and they did not provide sufficient blankets for winter. He survived on bread and water, and occasionally he may have had a sardine. In the process of this imprisonment, which included torture, he was daily tortured by the monks in this particular monastery in Toledo. They whipped him every day. So it's in this context that desire for Jesus deepens precisely when John feels entirely abandoned by God and cries out for union. He writes his poetry in this context. So ultimately, dark night is a radical dying to what we value in this world. So it's a dying to self, and it's a dispossession of what we have valued in the world. So he says, in the Ascent of Mount Carmel, he writes, "To come to possess all, desire the possession of nothing. To come to possess all, desire the possession of nothing." So it's in that context, before I dig into societal dark night, just to say that, so John of the Cross, remember, what's really important to remember is that dark night is God, okay? And what's critical to remember for John of the Cross, to remember when we feel like maybe we feel our prayer is dead, maybe it feels dry, we don't feel experiences that we've had in the past of the presence of God. It's in that very moment, in those times of when we experience absence, that God is at work. And John is always inviting us to remember that God is transforming desire into love. Okay, so it's in that context that I invite us really, I want to engage with Sister Connie FitzGerald's interpretation of what she calls societal dark night. Okay, there's dark night for our entire world, for our society. And the words I'm going to quote from her here, she wrote this in the early 1980s. And I think it's still fresh today. On the other side of our power and technology, our national will, and for our will for power and control, we have come to poverty and dark night. We can find no escape from the world we have built, where the oppressed and the poor cry out, where the earth and the environment cry out, and where the specter of nuclear waste haunts future generations. We dare not let the full import of impasse even come into complete consciousness. So when she uses the term impasse, impasse is another term for dark night. Impasse is a way of thinking about our perspective of dark night. And then she writes, "We recognize today the real possibilities of the death of the earth. We have failed for a long time to understand our own place in the earth community and the absolutely essential connections between ourselves as a human species and with all other species. In consequence, for the first time in the history of the cosmos, we face the death of humanity as a species and the death of our home, the earth." So right now, there are 7 planetary boundaries that we are exceeding. I have a picture here of the melting of the polar ice caps. Right now, as we speak, the Amazon, which is a major source of air for the world, is being destroyed. So, rational thinking has not provided a way out of this situation. And interconnected with these ecological crises are fundamentally intertwined with racial and economic crises and oppression. And someone was talking at the very beginning about, praying to work through our own racism. We white Americans conveniently forget that the economic rise of the United States depended upon an enslavement of the African and indigenous peoples, expropriating both labor and capital, and dispossessing African and indigenous peoples of lands and abundant resources. And it's in this context, I don't know if anyone recognizes themselves in the picture from Rochester, but the same economic and cultural way of life that's creating ecological devastation is also perpetuating police and vigilante violence against Black people at a rate that's nearly the same as that of lynching in the early 20th century. And it is this, what we call a modern system, that we're actually still colonizing Black, Latinx, and indigenous spaces and bodies through the school to prison pipeline, through hyper-incarceration, and by fostering a political economy of segregation through a combination of racially structured banking, real estate, and governmental policies that hasten physical decline in urban neighborhoods and forever incentivizes their perpetuation. And I can provide resources for these things, for the data here, if anyone wants. So this is a quote from Albert Einstein: "A problem cannot be solved at the same level of consciousness that created it." And the problems that we're dealing with in this world today are problems that have been built up over the last 500 years of a period that we call modernity. But there is a oppressive side to modernity that I've just been describing in terms of societal dark night. So we really need a collective transformation of consciousness, a transformation of consciousness that Pope Francis invites a shift from an egocentric consciousness to a Christocentric and earth-centric consciousness. And so what is that? How do you imagine that? What does that look like? And I just have I want to share this photograph of Aisha Evans protesting the murder by police of Alton Sterling in Baton Rouge in Louisiana in July of 2016. And she really, she embodies the contemplative love, the nonviolent stance of grace, of courage. I really sense a presence to the divine in this very moment when she's being arrested. So with that, before we get into reading The Dark Night, just want to say a few words about the poem before we actually read it. The Dark Night it's both a description of his experience in prison and his experience of escaping, as well as a description of God's transformative love within him when he had no sense of God at all. And I just want to give me a moment here. Um, I skipped over something. So just before we read the poem, just one last point as we take in the witness of Aisha Evans. So embracing dark night, there's a paradox involved in the journey for us. And the paradox is getting through dark night involves engaging with it, not avoiding it. It's not avoidance or escape or any attempt on our part to control it is counterproductive. And I think a way of what I see in Aisha Evans, the reason I show this image is I think there's also, she has a presence of what we call receptive generosity, which is a profound openness to dark night. And so I quote from Sister Connie. She says, "One has to allow the experience to take place through a love that is swelling up within us. One internalizes the option for the poor by hearing, lamenting, and being with and for people suffering homelessness, hunger, imprisonment, assault, police and vigilante violence, and the destruction of the fragile ecosystems of the earth. It is a dying in order to see how to be and to act for, with, and for God in the world." And so with that, before we take time with the poem, any questions, comments?
If anybody feels lost or has no idea what has been said up to this point, that's also helpful to say.
Yeah.
I did want to ask, you said he did escape and survive. Is that what you said, Alex?
Yeah, so that's a good question, Steve, because when he was in prison, he really was, like, physically, he was at the point of death. He even considered letting himself die. That's how dire the situation was. But as we read the poem is a description of his escape. So yes, he did escape. He was able to escape the monastery that was holding him. He made his way to a convent of the Reform Carmelites who supported him, and they took him in. They hid him, and then they nurtured him back to health, fed him, gave him a good place to sleep, etc. So yeah, that's a really good question. And in fact, in the very first stanza of the poem, when he refers to the secret ladder. The secret ladder is both, let me step back. So the cell he was in was like somewhere between 16 to around maybe 16 feet above a river. And if he was able to get out, there was a small window. If he went out that way, he would have fallen to his death. However, an interesting part of the story is that he got a second guard, a different guard in the last months he was there, and that guard provided him with linens and clothing that he used to turn into a rope that he used to get himself out of the cell and the monastery. And he refers to that as the secret ladder. But the secret ladder is also God, because when he was actually escaping, he describes how he didn't have his senses about him. So the secret ladder literally was God carrying him along. Other comments, questions?
I have a question. So I think I'm a little confused, sorry. So it sounds like you need to have this receptive generosity and be open to dark night. But then I thought I also heard sometimes you're not aware that it's working, that God is working inside of you.
Great. Yeah, excellent question. It's an excellent question because from our perspective, we could take time to go through, there's different sets of signs that John talks about that indicate dark night. The first set of signs have to do with dryness in prayer, okay? So what previously gave you a sense of the presence of God no longer works. Also, any kind of discursive prayer, like prayer maybe if we're praying with scripture, any kind of praying with scripture, we just may not feel it happening anymore. We may not connect with it affectively, okay? And also, there's a feeling on our part of disconnect from, like, the more that we try to be rational, the more that we try to engage analysis, working with our minds to solve what we perceive to be the issue, they don't work. And so we really do feel absence, okay? And then in addition to, like, for John, even in the deeper experience of dark night, he feels there's no feeling through the five senses. He has no feeling of God at all. He feels completely abandoned. Okay. So this is a really good question, because in our own time today, when people are feeling abandoned, we try to utilize different means of getting out of that predicament in our own society. That can be, for example, You know, I was talking about white supremacy, you know, right now, throughout the United States, there are 36 states that have introduced or passed legislation to prevent study of the history of slavery and racism in the United States. Okay, that is an attempt to repress reality. It's an attempt to repress a very critical impasse in our society at this time. We have all kinds of issues in our society with drugs, okay? All kinds of different drugs as means of escape, okay? Or also much of consumer spirituality in our society is about making ourselves just feel good about ourselves, and not really confronting the ways that we're involved in creating suffering in the world. Okay, so this is a really excellent question. And I was saying earlier what Sister Connie invites, and also what John of the Cross invites, is for us to remember that even when we feel absence, when we feel abandoned, when we may feel dead, that in that very experience of death is resurrection. Okay, so we, from our human finitude, from the limits of our humanity, were not able to grasp the love that is transforming us. So what's really most critical is nurturing mindfulness, nurturing presence, even when I don't feel that it's making a difference. Okay, so it's when I say receptive generosity, that's really a grace of God. It's not something that we do, but it is. But when we do experience it, we need to nurture it. And even if we don't get that affirmation of doing it, it's really key to be present, aware, to the impasses of our world now, because that is the way through to resurrection and new life. That is the way that we may yet have a transformation of social, societal consciousness.
Thank you.
So really good questions. Other comments, questions?
Alex, are we on our screen here? Are we seeing the whole? Is that the poem in its entirety?
No, that's only the first stanza.
Okay. You know, what I was looking at here is you were talking about that sort of like the dark night is that thing that we can all experience, right? But it can have this transformative power for us, right? So I'm looking at the speaker and thinking in this stanza, it's a really good thing here, right? Like you've got somebody kind of really pumped up in those first couple of lines. One dark night fired with love's urgent longings, the sheer grace. It's like he's interrupting himself to just say, this is great. I went out unseen, so he's my house now being still. Then I'm assuming that's kind of metaphorical, right? There's this
Okay.
stillness, right?
Okay, yeah, so this is great comment. This is really critical because that's why, remember at the beginning when I quoted from the Spiritual Canticle, where John, he talks, the very first line of the Spiritual Canticle, he refers to the letters to to Romans,
Yeah,
talking about God's groanings within us. Okay. So what he's referring to here is that when he was imprisoned and in the midst of abandonment, he also has this desire. He's crying out to God. He's crying out for connection to God. Okay. And so it's really important that you notice this. And it's important to notice it because right now, the earth is crying out for life to us. People of Ukraine are crying out to life for us. You know, people in Rochester are crying out for justice. People throughout the whole world are crying out for the end to various forms of oppression. That crying in itself, our groaning for desire, for love, for God, that's God transforming us. And so we need to be present to that and nurture that. So yeah, you're absolutely right. And it's this is also, I think it's also important. He wrote this, the entire poem was written after he had been repaired and healed. Okay. But that first line from the Spiritual Canticle that I quoted at the very beginning, he wrote that line when he was in prison.
this also keeps bringing me back to the story that you told at the beginning about your grandmother, you know, that moment in the darkness, you know, reaching out probably at like her most scared and lonely and
Yes.
troubled and whatever, but had this hand and this voice.
Yes, exactly. So it really can be, you know, both particular moments in our lives, and it also can be a very long period. Like for Teresa of Avila, she experienced uh, dryness and absence of God for 20 years. So for 20 years, she stayed with just being present, making herself present and listening for God for a period of 20 years, day in and day out.
I know I will be disqualified from sainthood category.
Yeah.
That's after about 20 minutes, I'm looking for some, and you know, I'm reflecting too. I know we want to get through the poem, but I think so much, especially, you know, having been born in the late 60s and coming up through an era of amazing prosperity and technology, in both a world of instant gratification, you know, that we live in now, sort of the ATM. I think I've inherited an ATM spirituality. Like if I put in my card, something's going to come out. But also sort of these meritocracies that I've been given for a lot of different reasons, whether it's the privileges I hold, but that somehow if I'm a good person, God's going to respond to me. and or that I'm entitled to a response. And then like even a third level, I think about like capitalist overlays of spiritualities of productivity, that if I just work hard enough,
Right.
answers will come my way, or
Right.
I'll be given grace, or all these things. And like the Dark Knight really knocks all those just down in many ways. And
It's
I find just a lot of inner wrestling tonight as I'm trying to take this in.
So would you all like to read the poem? I can't see people.
Yes, there were many heads nodding. Yes, so
How about if anyone who wants to, we could share in reading the poem. I'll start, and then Michael, if you could then take the next slide and so forth, that would be
yeah, and
great.
I'll call who's next on the screen near me, and then maybe each person calls upon the next person. And then if you don't want to read, just say
That's-
pass, please.
The dark night. On that glad night in secret, for no one saw me, nor did I look at anything, with no other light or guide than the one that burned in my heart. This guided me more surely than the light of the moon, of the noon, to where he was awaiting me. Him I know so well, there in a place where no one appeared. It's not going now. There it is.
O guiding night, O night more lovely than the dawn, O night that has united the lover with his beloved, transforming the beloved in her lover. Upon my flowering breast, which I kept for him alone, there he lay sleeping, and I caressing him, there in a breeze from the fanning cedars. Ken? You need to unmute.
When the breeze blew from the turret, as I parted his hair, it wounded my neck with its gentle hand, suspending all my senses. I abandoned and forgot myself. Laying my face on my beloved, all things ceased. I went out from myself, leaving my cares forgotten among the lilies. Do I choose?
That's
That was it.
it.
Oh, okay.
Would you mind, Alex? I don't know if there's stuff you want to refer back to, or if you bring us back to stop sharing so that we're all back on the. Great, thanks.
So it's heavy stuff, no doubt, but I really feel very deeply it's worth engaging, and that it is a way of transformation of consciousness that really holds hope and love, for the transformation of the whole world. Our whole way of being in our society is, I think we have to contend with the reality that it is not working. It does not provide life for the earth, does not provide life for oppressed peoples everywhere. And so, the Sister Connie with Societal Dark Night really invites a transformation of our entire way of being, from an egocentric way of life to a really deep consciousness of the earth and all peoples of the world, so that we may live into a way of life that sustains life for the planet and really enables all people everywhere to thrive as human beings, and to reach our fulfillment in God and each other.
And Alex, at the risk of, a profound misunderstanding of everything you've just said, would you offer, and this is the word that I don't like, but I'm just going to say it anyway, practical, like where would this connect with our lives?
Yeah.
In terms of prayer life, in terms of spirituality, in terms of what we might be going through, how might this manifest for us, and to make that connection between all of this and when we go to bed tonight and wake up tomorrow to live our day.
Yep. Okay, so number one, all of us have, if to try to put it in a practical way, all of us have a monk within us. We all have a monk within us, okay? So, and what do I mean by that? So one thing that we can do during this Lent is to nurture the monk within us. And by that, I mean what we've been talking about, namely taking time to make yourself, as we did we did at the top of this session, take time to nurture silence in solitude, to become present, and to open ourselves to God working within us. So that can be, you can do that 5 minutes a day. If you haven't done it, you can start with short time and then slowly build up the time of just being present and aware. And it's what we call nurturing the monk within. Okay, that's one thing. Okay. Another thing is, I should have said this earlier, but this is not an invitation to doing nothing. It's not an invitation to kind of a reckless anarchy. That's not what Sister Connie is talking about. However, it's recognizing that, okay, all those things I was talking about, ecological devastation, racism, economic oppression, patriarchy. You have different speakers that are going to be speaking about different issues that we're confronting in the world today. All of those concerns are things that we can focus on in different ways, including acts of mercy. Okay, even if you're not feeling the presence of God, something very practical that we can do is to feed the hungry. Go be of service to the prison ministry. You have multiple avenues within Spiritus Christi and in Rochester just to perform acts of mercy, okay? Because what John is inviting is practical love of neighbor, okay? So if we have opportunities like opportunities to lament, like when Daniel Prude died in Rochester, if there is a time to lament that loss of life, you can engage that lament, whether you feel it or not. That engagement is a way that we connect with our brothers and sisters in love, okay? So that's another thing. Then, thirdly, what we've been talking about this whole time is transformation of consciousness. So things that we can do in terms of transformation of consciousness, it could be as simple as literally planting a seed, in your kitchen, on a windowsill. Planting one seed is revolutionary in this world. Or starting a garden, or being part of a community garden, being a part of community composting. Anything as a community that we can do together to shift away from fossil fuels to different ways of living in harmony with the earth. That's the kind of change that's being invited. And I could do a whole other presentation on multiple opportunities for developing an ecological consciousness that's transformative for the whole world. So those are the practical things I would say. Also, join us for folks that haven't. If you want to join in with Spark, join the work of Spark. Join in the work of our White Caucus. That's a very real way to engage a very specific impasse in our world.
Thank you.
Does that help?
It helps me. Yeah, thank you. And I saw some nods and others, so I know it helps to ground me. And I also know from the first point too that even if nothing seems to be happening in our prayer life, stay with it.
Yes, exactly. So that's really the key. And that's why it's key to, especially in the times that we're in right now, because if I have to say, if we do not nurture silence, a silent way of prayer, we're not going to be able to face the suffering of this world. Okay, because the suffering that's happening, it can be just suffering within us as well as suffering of others in the world. It's too much right now. It's way too much. I know for me during the pandemic, I had times when I can't take it. But if we nurture silence together and prayer together and, performing acts of mercy and taking care of the earth together, those are things that we can do to nurture God's love for us and the whole world. That's where there's hope. Real hope.
That was good, Alex. I enjoyed I did get a little lost through some of your
Okay.
talk, but I loved your summary. It really helped a lot. I
Okay.
would love to get the slides because I want to read that poem again. It was
Okay.
really good and study it a little bit. But,
Okay.
thank
Yeah,
you.
I can provide the one book that I showed earlier. I can provide resources. There is a book that's a collection of John of the Cross's, all of his writings. There's also a very helpful biography. It's a biography. It's entitled John of the Cross, Man and Mystic. It's a book by Richard Hardy. It's a really outstanding biography, super helpful if you want to enter into prayer with John a little more.
And Alex, if you send me a few of those resources, again,
I will.
I'll send an email out to everybody. Hopefully you got the email that went out late tonight. It went out just before this. But if you did not get that, then please let me know, because something's breaking down in our forms system that should be working. And so, but I will send out all those resources. And, given that tonight was recorded, we are going to be uploading all of this Lenten series to the Spiritus Christi YouTube channel, so that people can, click on a link on the website and just get to these resources again. Because I know for me, now that I'm where I am, I do actually want to go back to the beginning and take it all in again, because I think that would be useful. So I really thank you, Alex. And I know we're a little over time. If anyone has a last thoughts, questions, comments, reflections.
I listened to what you were saying at the end, and in a sense, it took me back to the beginning, because one of the earlier slides that you shared, and then several times in the materials you went through, you talked about, there was one that said to possess it all, you have to not possess, you got to give it away. And this whole idea of, in order to do the things you just talked about, you got to let go of what you have right now, is kind of where my head is, or what it's making me think about. What do you have to give up now, or turn away from now, in order to move in the direction that you're just describing, in terms of things that we could be doing, things that we could become involved in? That's what I've been thinking about a lot as I was listening.
Yeah, and so that's an excellent point, especially because I think it's really hard for us, because I think that we need to we're going to have to give up living on a fossil fuel economy. We're going to have to give up gas fueled engines. We're going to have to give up our dependence on gas and oil. And, I know most people in the street are going to say, Alex is crazy, we'll go somewhere else. But the fact of the matter is, this fossil fuel economy, it's literally killing us. It's killing the world. And so there is a real need for dispossession of what we have most valued in this economy and this culture. So that's an excellent point. Yes, he says, in order to possess all, we must be dispossessed of everything. And that's hard for Americans, because it goes against everything our culture values. So yeah, that's a really good thing to be with. And just a last before we split up, I also want to emphasize that, so this, while this can be a really scary experience, to always remember that it's God's love at work in us, okay? Also that during Lent, it's really critical, get enough sleep, especially if you're fasting on particular days, to be sure to, be drinking enough water, take care of your body, because your body needs energy. It needs rest to be able to really take up this kind of prayer, of fasting, and loving our brothers and sisters. So thank you so much. Thank you for being with me. Is just a real